All right, let's try this again. Sorry, had to cut that off there rather quickly. The battery on the old laptop was dying, and the notification popped up smack in the middle of the screen. So had to go and run and get my charger and plug in. Anyway, picking up where we left off, we are talking about some of the products that become highly valuable and highly prized and kind of fuel imperialism in the late 1800s as cars become more prevalent in societies. You start to have rubber for tires become highly in demand. Palm oil as a natural lubricant for machine parts. Also, as the middle class begins to expand and grow, things like cacao to make chocolate for candies and things like that become in higher and higher demand. But probably the most important to industrialized states, especially in Western Europe, is to find new markets for their manufactured goods. Um, we've talked about how these Western European states are pretty well landlocked and highly fragmented, and their growing populations, even as fast as they grow, um, cannot hope to keep up demand for the massive supply of industrialized goods that are coming out of factories. So these Western industrialized states are forced to seek out new markets, new customers. This is going to create conflict with China and India that we'll talk about in more detail in the next unit. But it's a huge motivating factor in imperialism. Now, economic and political demands are not the only things driving imperialism in the 19th century. There's two social trends that form in the 19th century, both of which proved to be pretty dangerous. One of them is the idea of social Darwinism. So, social Darwinism is this belief, incorrectly based upon the idea of natural selection from Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution, that you can apply the same concepts of animal evolution to human societies. And in the 19th century, a lot of people in the industrialized world, especially in Western Europe and the Americas, begin to believe that white Judeo Christian enlightened culture and white Judeo Christian enlightened people are the superior race or master race on planet Earth. And they look at the most recent 4 centuries of cultural output, especially coming out of Western Europe, things like the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, the Protestant Reformation, industrialization, and they point to these things and say, well, since the people of Western Europe accomplished these long before anyone else, and they've been able to integrate them into their society long before everyone else, this is evidence of their natural innate superiority to the other races and ethnicities of the planet. Now, this leads to another popular cultural trend within industrialized states, especially, again, Western Europe and the United States, of what becomes known as the white man's burden. And this is the belief that over a long enough timeline, the white race would eventually, similar to Darwin's ideas on natural selection, would eventually outbreed, outcompete, and then would end up eliminating all of the other races and ethnicities of the world, conveniently ignoring the previous 2,500 years of human society, where Western Europe was essentially a cultural backwater of the world. Anyway, so in order to prevent this from taking place, many people begin to feel that it is the duty and the responsibility of the white race to go out into the world and to civilize inferior cultures and societies, to bring white Judeo Christian enlightened culture to these areas, whether the people in those areas are wanted or not, essentially saving them from their own destruction, right? Now, A lot of this is backed up by the arrival of numerous pseudosciences in the 19th century. One of the most popular of these being the idea of phrenology, where in the middle to late 19th century, many people believed that it was possible to gauge someone's intellectual and cultural abilities and attributes based on the size and shape of their skull, the distance between their facial features, the size and shape of their facial features, etc. Now, accompanying this racist justification for imperialism are also the growing demands of nationalism, right? So, nationalism really becomes a huge political force after the French Revolution. It is used by French leaders like Napoleon to rally and unify these highly divisive, highly, antagonistic French people who have spent 12 to 15 years slaughtering one another over political revolution. Um, Napoleon is able to use this sense of national pride, this sense of being French over all things, to rally and unify the people under his empire. And then he uses that to begin expanding and conquering most of Western Europe. And nationalism becomes a really powerful political tool in the 1800s. Um, Leaders in the German states use it to help unify Germany into a single political unit. The Italians do the same thing, and they're able to use nationalism as a tool to break down the other individual bonds that are dividing the German and the Italian people. They begin to get people to put aside political differences, economic differences, religious differences, which is a massive, massive dividing force in Germany and Italy in in the 1800s, thanks to the Protestant Reformation. But politicians and rulers begin to use nationalism as a way to unify people behind one single set of ideas and to get them to place that above all of the other differences that separate them. Now, this becomes not only a political tool, but it also becomes a source of cultural pride for the people of Western Europe, the United States, especially the industrialized countries, because they begin to see this as a competition for national greatness. And the best way to demonstrate that national greatness is to collect and gather as many colonies as possible, more colonies than your neighbors and the competing cultural groups, right? So this leads to things like the Scramble for Africa and the Berlin Conference, where the nation states of Western Europe essentially sit down in Berlin and redraw the map of Africa to suit themselves and to suit their liking, essentially redrawing all of the borders with no consideration for social groups or cultural norms or for, you know, societies that have essentially been at war with one another for centuries now are just simply grouped together based on what's most convenient for the states of Western Europe. Um, Now, nationalism also is important because not only is it used to unify new states like Germany, like Italy, like Japan in the 18th century, but this demand and this race for colonies also gives those states a method with which, geez, with which they can challenge their older, wealthier, more established neighbors, the Great Britons, the Russias, the Chinas, etc. Right? So what you see here is a baby phonics book. We've all seen these. We've all had these when we were kids. Teaching kids to read by recognizing letters and the sounds that accompany them. But the reason I put this one into the presentation is because it demonstrates pretty declaratively this combination of racial justification, of nationalistic pride, of the race for colonial and world dominance that swells in Western Europe and in the United States in the 19th century, right? So you have things like B stands for battles, by which England's name has forever been covered with glory and fame. C is for colonies, rightly we boast that of all the great nations, Great Britain has most. So within the very wording of this, phonics books designed for children to kind of indoctrinate children at a very young age, you see the strong, you see the strong backdrop that nationalism has on Western European society in the 18th and 19th century. The very notion of national greatness is not being measured by scientific output or by literary achievements or by musical or artistic standards. The sole measure of national greatness is world domination. It's colonies, it's winning battles, it's defeating these other cultural groups who claim to be superior to you, right? Now, you can also see through the visuals here a clear demarcation and a clear sign of the racial justification as well here. If you look at the images, you see a obviously British man seated eating, right? While a Aboriginal or dark-skinned young woman holds an umbrella to shade him. And the implications here, especially for children at a very young impressionable age, is that the rightful place of people of a darker skin color than you is kneeling and serving you. And not only kneeling and serving you, but on the same level as the animals of the world, right? As she kneels next to what is a poorly drawn kangaroo, right? Again, here in D, you can see the obvious nationalism at work here. The visual demonstrates pretty readily, the pride in military conquest, in being greater, more powerful, more daring than one's neighbors. One of ours is worth six of theirs. Again, empire. E is our empire where the sun never sets. The larger we get it, or the larger we make it, the bigger it gets. Again, demonstrating that colonial conquest is the measure by which national greatness should be measured. You also have in this one, I is for India, our land in the east, where everyone goes to shoot tigers and feast. Again, this just simply demonstrates the superiority of these industrialized Western nations towards their colonial possessions and their colonized subjects, right? Where India is not recognized even as a separate land or a separate people, it's simply portrayed as a plaything, right? Our land in the East, we go there to shoot tigers and feast. That the idea that these colonies exist simply for our enjoyment and our entertainment and to supply us with what we need. Again, pretty clear racial imagery here, right? The civilized white man teaching the uncivilized dark skinned man how to read and how to be quote unquote civilized in the Western Christian white sense of the word, right? Again, like we said, massive technological and military advantages. This is one of the first fully automated weapons that's introduced into warfare in the late 1800s. This is known as the Maxim gun. Now, repeating rifles like this or repeating large caliber weapons like this were not new. There were things like the Gatling gun, which was hand cranked. But the Maxim is the first fully automated, fully mechanized gun that did not require any human labor to power it. Also, here you have some images regarding the ideas of phrenology, right? This is this pseudoscience where it was believed that one could measure intellectual and cultural capabilities based on the size and the shape of one's skull. And a lot of misrepresentation and misrepresented science was published in the 19th century to attempt to justify this racist motivation for imperial colonization.